This is Relationscapes, the podcast where we map the stories and ideas that shape our identities and connect us with each other as we try to build a better world. I'm journalist Blair Hodges, and our guide in this episode is education journalist Laura Pappano.
I was completely baffled by what I was hearing, that your children are facing existential danger and harm from the very people who are supposed to be protecting and educating them. And it's your job as a parent to stand up, speak out, and fight.
As a journalist working the education beat, Laura Pappano had seen a lot, but even she was stunned by what she witnessed at the conference of a group called Moms for Liberty in Florida. They were sounding the alarm about Marxism, social and emotional learning, critical race theory, and pornographic books in school libraries. And these moms weren't there just to complain. They were organizing and training to help take over local school boards across the country. As a longtime advocate for effective public education, Pappano knew she needed to do something more than just publish a news article to explain this rising extremism. She joins us now to talk about her new book, School Moms: Parent Activism, Partisan Politics, and the Battle for Public Education. Laura Pappano, welcome to Relationscapes.
Glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
You begin this book, School Moms, by saying that you didn't plan to write this book. You didn't really even maybe want to write this book because there's a ton of stuff you could write about when it comes to schools. And maybe I thought at the very outset, give us an idea of what some of those other things you would rather write about are.
Oh, man, there's so many. I love writing about low-income first-gen kids. I love my newspaper kids, grades 3 through 8. I love kids' curiosity. I love questions about inequality in school. I love clever ways of teaching math. There's so many things that need our attention in schools. Absolutely.
And yet, here we are. The book School Moms: Parent Activism, Partisan Politics, and the Battle for Public Education is the book you did write. So tell me what the tipping point was. Why did you finally decide to do this book?
Well, I've covered education, K-12 and higher ed for over 30 years, and I was seeing so much happening in public schools that did not have to do with education. In fact, what I was seeing was getting in the way of the big questions that we have about education. I mean, the deep questions about education are, how do we optimize for every child their opportunity to learn? And, learning doesn't happen to you. You are motivated to connect and learn. And how do we do that? I'm enormously interested in that. But this stuff was getting in the way of it. And when I say stuff, what I'm talking about is the far-right political attack on public schools, which is taking these really communal community spaces and turning them into a political platform to gain far-right power. I mean, Steve Bannon has said as much. He said at the CPAC in early 2022, he said, school boards are the key that picks the lock. I mean, I find it unconscionable because as a public school student myself, as a parent in PTOs with kids in school, I never knew what anyone's politics were. I didn't care, and it simply didn't matter because it was about the community we were forging. And to see that deep trust, that role fractured, really made me feel compelled. And plus, having covered schools for so long, I was hearing a lot of stuff that didn't make any sense, just flat out made up stuff. So I felt as a journalist that it was my job to kind of correct the record.
Some of those big things that I hear are that schools are these places of indoctrination where the leftist agenda is being programmed into the kids who are being brainwashed into Marxism and all these kind of things. You take a step back from that and say, okay, let's hold on a second and let's take a look at what schools are generally supposed to be for. So talk about why public schooling matters and why you're such an advocate for it.
Absolutely. I mean, I know that we get caught up in test scores and NAEP scores and performance, and that certainly does matter. But we forget that one of the big functions of public school is that it brings together people from different backgrounds, and you learn to negotiate and get along. You might like some things about somebody and dislike other things, but you figure out how to make it work. And it's that fundamental role. I mean, John Dewey made the point that it's the experience of school. His point was that we're not going to raise citizens and by civics classes. We're going to do our education of our citizens through the experience of going to public school together.
I like this vision of school as a microcosm of community, and that this is a place where kids can get socialized into how to interact with people that have different backgrounds, that have different beliefs, and where diversity is celebrated not just for its own sake, but because diversity is a reality in the world. And so, like you said, John Dewey's like, we're going to learn facts and skills and math and these kind of things, and that's great. We also want to help train some citizens that can participate in a pluralistic society. That's why there have long been tensions about the role of schools, right? So take us back to the 60s and 70s when we see some big changes happening with the Department of Education, with the Elementary and Secondary Ed Act. You give us some of this history to set up the context for what's happening today.
For sure. I mean, if we go way back to the turn of the century and I shouldn't say the century, the last century, the century before the one we're in now, the creation of common schools was really a recognition that everybody needed some education and needed some schooling. I mean, I think it was in World War I where a vast percentage of the people who were signing up were illiterate.
Yeah, people couldn't read.
People could not read. And we forget that now, but the motivation was to educate, to train. That Industrial Revolution, everyone wasn't working on a farm anymore, and we needed people who had the ability to acquire skills. And at the same time, schools played this really important role of gathering people to learn. And there are moms who are, if we look at some of the basis of the child labor laws, right? We look at the mandatory school attendance. A lot of the kind of things that we take for granted now grew out of our first experience with public education. And if you continue this, every era, I mean, you could look at 1957, the Sputnik era, you suddenly had the federal government feeling like, oh my gosh, the best way to advance our country and our citizens is to really infuse science education into our public schools. So at a moment when we seem to lack a consistent and whole culture, public schools are the closest we come. I mean, if you look at it, 90% of children in America attend public schools. We can have all the fights and battles we want about so-called educational freedom or parent choice, and we can talk about what all those things are and the rhetoric around them. But the bottom line is that it has been our collective role to educate the next generation. And, the federal government plays a role in that. The federal government doesn't spend a lot of the average contribution to the local school budget is about, federal government spends about 9% of the schools on public, not 9% of the federal
budget. Yeah,
budget.
9% of the budget comes from...
Of course not. But they make up 9% of spending on public schools. And most of it is state and local, and which is why you see so much action right now in state legislatures and on local school boards, because that's where the money is coming from. But to the point about how schools have evolved, there's long been this kind of battle with the religious right, if we go back to the 70s, of wanting prayer in school. And a number of them met with President Carter, who's a born-again Christian, and he said, absolutely not. What's interesting about this evolution, this relationship between religion and school, is that when it didn't work to kind of say, we want to put God into school, we want to put religion into school, the religious right changed their approach. Jerry Falwell was very clever in kind of changing the kind of language. He started using secular language, and he started using language that it's students' rights to pray. It's parental rights to control what's taught.
The freedom to pray.
The freedom. All of that kind of, if you will, liberal kind of language around rights and what one is allowed and owed and permitted has been flipped. So we saw that starting to happen with the religious right in the 1970s. And, I saw it as an education columnist for the Boston Globe when I started covering a battle around sex education in the 1990s. So you had, the AIDS crisis in the late 1980s, and that changed what needed to be taught in sex ed classes. So suddenly we had to use the words condom and homosexuality, and that spurred a real uprising and backlash and attacks by Christian Coalition and other organizations. So this kind of moment that we're in is not brand new. We've seen iterations of it before.
Yeah, that's right. And people might be wondering, give us the 30-second version of what the federal government is supposed to be doing with education. You gave us an idea of what kind of money they contribute, percentage of the budget. Right. But what is the federal government controlling and what are state governments controlling?
Absolutely. So federal governments initially, there was a lot of resistance to having a U.S. Department of Education, and there is still opposition to that. In fact, when I was at the Moms for Liberty Summit, the first one, when Betsy DeVos called for its abolition, she got a standing ovation. So the federal government...
And she was put in charge of that department.
And she was put in charge of it, exactly. But what the federal government's role in education is, I think of it often as guardrails, special education, laws, Title IX regulations, Title I, money for schools that have high percentages of high poverty students, school lunch programs, the things that really are a baseline.
And the Title IX you spoke to have to do with racial, sexual discrimination, stuff like that.
Title IX, gender discrimination, race would be, the Civil Rights Act. The point being is that the federal government, Johnson, when he spoke to Congress about the Secondary Education Act was all about, was really, it was very aspirational. It was it didn't matter what zip code you were in, how wealthy your parents were, what disabilities you might have grown up with or have. Everyone was going to get access to a wonderful public education. And it's that role, it's that kind of, I think of it as this kind of guardrail policing role. It's why you're seeing, record numbers of, civil rights complaints being filed with the Department of Education right now, because that is who is That's looking at that. But, you have after Brown versus Board of Education. Even when
Supreme Court case,
Court case, 1952, even after that, you have the mass resistance in Virginia. It took 5 years before those schools were integrated. And then you had the rise of segregation academies.
The predecessor of charter schools.
Where white families sought ways to, not have their children attend schools with Black students. And we're seeing a replay of that now. And we look at the voucher movement. We're seeing a replay of that exact thing, where people are looking at using public money to skirt going to school with other children who are not like them.
Right. So we see this local resistance to federal involvement. And as far as states are concerned, they're providing most of the budget, and they're also overseeing a lot of the curriculum with some input from the federal government, and usually in how they tie funding to stuff. Is that right? We want things to meet certain standards?
Well, it's gone back and forth. Having covered the whole gamut of this over the years, No Child Left Behind was really a pretty powerful federal foray into control of education. And they never...
Yeah, this is the early 2000s.
Yes, exactly. I was struck by it because education had been very much of a kind of local and state affair, but the federal government was playing a pretty prominent role.
Under a Republican administration,
Yeah. And I remember going to a middle school, I believe it was in Lynn, Massachusetts, and walking in and talking with the principal. I said, well, what do you think of this? These curriculums, these demands. And he said to me, well, at least now we know what to teach. Before, if you like long division, you taught long division. If you like dinosaurs, you taught dinosaurs. And I think that has been a long-standing battle in education between the kind of supremacy and, role of the teacher to be in control of the classroom, every aspect of what was happening there, and the outside government requirements of what should be taught. I think we need some of both. We need teachers to feel empowered and creative to be their most wonderful selves, but we also need to make sure that everyone is learning and having access to a good and quality education.
Okay, that's a perfect segue because in addition to those two things, then there's also like parents, right? And so you say that women all along, especially, have played a large role in the shape of public education. Women were extending their domestic leadership into school spaces. It became sort of a women's role to be concerned about what the kids were up to. And so for a long time, women have usually been the ones on PTAs and in the classroom. And now we see this rise of the school moms that you write about in this book who really want to start having a big say in what the curriculum is. So you had the federal government talking about curriculum, you had local control over curriculum. Now we get this third component of parents coming in and saying, actually, we should control the curriculum.
Well, I mean, there are a couple of things there. When you bring up women's roles, I mean, what we're also talking about is that women were involved because women were allowed to have, quote unquote, authority over children, right? Because it was considered natural. If you go back to the Victorian era, you know, in the separate spheres where the men had the public sphere and the women were experts of home,
right.
It was very natural for women to gain power by asserting that province over the home. And this is where you saw women even saying, you know, we should make the whole world our home. And, you know, some of it was, when you read it, the original documents are kind of humorous, the old magazines. But the point about parents' rights is that it's actually trickier than it looks on the outside. Parents do have rights. They have always had rights. Mm-hmm. They also, I think most profoundly, as a parent of 3 children who are now grown, myself, I mean, you have influence. To me, that is the most powerful thing of all. And what we're seeing now with quote unquote parental rights is really just a language game to take control over things that professionals were in charge of, whether it was librarians who were very well educated, curating collections of books, or teachers, or people who are doing curriculum work. I mean, there are professionals who actually train to understand, you know, if you were doing this kind of math this year, this is what we should do next year or next week. And that there's a kind of a logic flow to it. I mean, I used to teach my children a lot of stuff, but it was mostly whatever I happened to be interested in, back to that old teacher model.
Yeah.
And you know what? It was a lot of fun, but I would hate to have those be the cornerstones of their education.
Yeah, that's right. Well, let's meet some of these moms in particular that you cover in the book. And your first chapter takes us to the Tampa Convention Center in 2022. There's a group called Moms for Liberty that's rallying, and you're in attendance as a reporter, but you're a little bit incognito. You could blend in there. And so tell us a little bit about who this group is and what started Moms for Liberty.
Yes, so I registered under my name. I did, though, dress to fit in. I wasn't trying to hide, but I didn't want to draw too much attention to myself.
So you didn't wear like a fedora with a note card sticking out of it that said press?
No, but I can tell you that having covered education for years and years, if I'm doing a story, I try to wear the right outfit, right?
Yeah.
You're dressing to fit in. I wasn't trying to hide. On the other hand, I went in there, most importantly, I went in there not like, do I agree or disagree? My job as a journalist is, does this make sense? What am I hearing? What's the logic that's unfolding in front of me?
Yeah.
And I guess the thing that was most surprising to me was that I expected that I would be confused, meaning I expected that I would hear some things and I'd think, I hadn't thought of it that way before. And that's how they're kind of framing it. I was stunned at how absurd and outlandish it was from the start. And I guess the absurdity was just compounded by the fact that at the very same time, kitty corner to the Moms for Liberty Summit was a Tampa Convention Center, which was hosting MetroCon, which was the largest anime gathering in Florida. So there I am, you know, in the hotel lobby and on the streets, and there are people with wings and horns and glitter and colonial garb. It was surreal. Inside the Moms for Liberty Summit, what I saw, which struck me immediately, was that I was hearing things that were outlandish. I was hearing that sending your child to public schools for 30 to 35 hours a week was like sending them to a Maoist reform prison camp. I heard that social emotional learning, which I had written about when it was first being kind of organized in schools 20 years earlier, was a form of Marxist indoctrination. I heard that teachers and educators were trying to change the gender of your child. I mean, having been in hundreds, if not thousands of classrooms, having a daughter who is an educator, I was completely baffled by what I was hearing until I saw that this was not about trying to reveal some deep truth. This was about frightening this group of 500 moms, mostly moms, into fearing that their children were in danger. And we heard that over and over and over again over 4 days, that your children are facing existential danger and harm from the very people who are supposed to be protecting and educating them. And it's your job as a parent to stand up, speak out, and fight and battle. And that was really stunning to me because, I mean, a lot of the rhetoric for decades has been schools and parents working together for the good of children. And suddenly you had the language of these moms being about, we are warriors, we are war moms. And that was, they use that.
Yeah, all the militant metaphors.
Right. Yeah. And just to pick up on what you just mentioned, the language of violence and the invocation of violence that we are hearing and seeing around this issue is really, really, really concerning. And what also struck me was at the same time, one of the board members of Moms for Liberty, a lawyer, stood up and he was talking about the Don't Say Gay law. And he was saying, it's done a lot of good, but we have to do more to the law. It's not enough. And he then said, well, it's like if you have an AK-47. You need a finder, you need a laser. And this was a handful of weeks after Uvalde.
Whoa.
I was disgusted.
That's tragic school shooting, yeah.
Tragic school shooting. And he's using an AK-47 as a metaphor to talk about a law. And what was even probably more upsetting was to see that nobody in the room even reacted. It was just accepted. And that's when I realized that there was something else going on here. That this was not really about how do we make things better for all kids. How do we educate them better? How do we have better schools? This was about an agenda and a plan, and it was a political plan. And I find that is a wrongful use of public education.
We'll lay some of that plan out as we go, but I also wanted to point out that the Moms for Liberty group kind of was sparked by the pandemic. So
Certainly.
One of the biggest early concerns was masking and distance learning and things like this, where people who are anti-vax and people who are skeptical of science and skeptical of the pandemic took this as an opportunity to put education on trial, to say they're hurting our kids.
Certainly. What it allowed was people who were upset anyhow. I mean, let's be honest, everybody was upset. I don't think there's anybody nobody was happy. There's a lot of pent up and frustrated emotions, especially the parents who were at home trying to, school their children while the schools were closed. But I also remember that we didn't know a lot. And my daughter had people in her school whose family members had died as a result. So we have to remember where we were at that time.
And then it could easily connect with other ideas. You mentioned social and emotional learning. So it goes from masks to this indoctrination of social emotional learning. Maybe take 60 seconds to lay out the basics of SEL, what that is, so people that don't know about it can know.
Social emotional learning is, it's a really simple idea. There's a psychologist who actually read the book and wrote a note, and I did a session with her. She said kids often come into school and they're on fire emotionally. And it's really hard to learn when you're on fire. And the point of social emotional learning is to just get everybody gathered, grounded. And when I was writing about it in a Boston Globe column many years ago, I interviewed one of Pam Siegel, who in 1987 was one of the people early to start this. And she was a teacher. And she said, my lessons were going out the window because someone was upset about who stole the glitter pen and blamed it on somebody else. And we all have, if you have any contact with children, something like that can just disrupt everything. So the idea of social emotional learning is like, let's come together, let's take a second to talk it out, and let's then gather ourselves up and move on. Because it's when you're present that you can learn. And so what I find so absurd is that people on the far right complain about social emotional learning. They say, we should get rid of the social emotional learning and focus on reading, writing, and math, and it's, well, social emotional learning allows you to do the reading, writing, and math because everybody is in the same collective place. And it goes back to what we were talking about before with schools being a community. Schools are communities. Yeah. Classrooms are communities. If you hate your teacher, if you hate the culture in your classroom,
or if you feel like your teacher hates you.
Right. If you do not feel like you are all in sync, you're not going to learn. And the opposite is true. If you are all in this kind of fluid, relational space that the teacher is an expert in creating, then you're going to learn and you're going to be eager and you're going to learn more than you would have if you're just sitting there doing a pile of worksheets.
And so if people are wondering like how people could become freaked out about that, because all it really is establishing behavioral norms, some ways that kids can emotionally regulate themselves, how a classroom can run effectively, mindfulness, growth mindset, which is kind of this sort of positive thinking and believing in yourself, this kind of stuff. Well, how could anyone think that could be evil? Well, it also connects with ideas of tolerance and acceptance of others, and that can connect into LGBTQ issues and to look at racism as a problem. And I think that's where some of these moms start freaking out, is saying, wait a minute, this is part of some sort of agenda to make everybody think that being gay is okay. And of course, me personally, and many people believe being gay is okay, so that's not a problem. But for people who have a problem with that, it's easy then to take something like social and emotional learning and turn it into this boogeyman. So you're witnessing this at the convention where people are talking about SEL. They're talking about these things in these strange ways, comparing it to cultural Marxism and frightening things. And they're also really tactical. They're trying to generate local candidates to take over school boards. They're trying to talk to lobbyists who can contact lawmakers. They want to create model legislation that can be passed in a state and then passed around to other states. And they're also distributing talking points that they can use for everyday people on the street. So this is very well organized. It's very politically minded, very politically engaged, and very politically sophisticated. And this is going to start popping up. I remember during the pandemic seeing these school board meetings were being disrupted, and you have a chapter on school boards. So let's talk about school boards and what Moms for Liberty and other groups are trying to do with school boards.
Well, I think you've set it up really nicely in that, and that's that there is a whole far right group, ALEC, the Goldwater Institute, that have this model conservative legislation that we are now seeing kind of pop up in legislatures. But there is this whole far right agenda. And in a way, the Moms for Liberty, the school boards, the people showing up and yelling at school boards about masking was kind of a revelatory moment for these far right organizations who for decades had been looking for an entree into this world. And what they alighted on was the power of moms. When I was at that first summit, I was walking outside and talking to people at the tables. And one of the conservative institutes was pointing out to me, we have just started doing school board training. And they were like, 600 people signed up already. This was July 2022. In August, the Leadership Institute, another conservative organization, started online school board training. School boards had been simply overlooked. And now they were recognizing that not only were school boards useful and could be won, it turns out we learned, doing research by, sometimes 8 or 10% turnout, by very few
super
votes.
Low turnout.
Super low turnout.
Yep, you can flip a board with a couple dozen people.
And some money, and which is exactly what we have seen. And so what the Moms for Liberty did very effectively, that we are still seeing the residue of now, is they framed the language. They framed the talking points. And the far-right groups were simply waiting for this opportunity. So you have the school boards, and if you go back 2 years to, the spring of 2022, there's actually a company called Patriot Mobile, which is a Christian cell phone company in Texas.
Ooh.
And they donate 5% of their profits to far right, the NRA, different groups. They list them all on their website. They're not trying to hide that. But then in January 2022, they started the Patriot Mobile Action PAC. So Political Action Committee. It's a super PAC, so they can't donate directly to local candidates, but they can donate to local PACs, which then got created in order to receive their money. And what they did...
And they help with advertising and pumping up candidates and so on and so forth.
Yes, absolutely. So yes, they have money, connections, strategists. So what they were able to do was take about $400,000, which on a national level is not that much, but they could distribute it in over 11 school board races in North Texas, which is a lot of money in a school board race, right? You take in 4 districts. And suddenly, I started seeing, circulars that looked awfully professional and box trucks circling around neighborhoods. And when I looked into, started following the money, I noticed that a lot of the printing and strategy and stuff were coming from Axiom Strategies in Kansas City, Missouri, which, come to discover, is a major political outfit that does Ron DeSantis's work, Glenn Youngkin, that is a stalwart, Ted Cruz. So you've got these national political strategists who are now being involved in local school board races. And what happens? Those 4 school boards flipped with really serious consequences.
Yeah, the biggest irony to me is it's under the guise of local control. But what's happening is these elections are being sort of taken over by national party interests that don't map well onto local conditions. And so you'll get local school boards that you report on in this book that all of a sudden are doing all these weird rules and regulations that the local communities don't want because they're coming from these national party priorities under the guise of saying it's about local control.
You're 1,000% right. I mean, that's the travesty. And I also saw this last fall in Idaho. I was in North Idaho doing a story that for Hechinger Report and Vanity Fair, where I spent 6 months following, school board races. And what had happened is in this West Bonner County, you had some far-right candidates who took over the school district, and they got rid of the levy didn't pass. A third of the budget was cut. They sent back the English language arts curriculum because it contained social emotional learning, which it did. And suddenly you had some very angry Republican, conservative, religious moms who were seeing their local public schools attacked by extremists. So they organized a recall of 2 of the candidates, and then I was again on the ground for Election Day because there were 3 seats open. And what were the issues in the election? I mean, I was looking at the circulars, and there was so-called transgenderism, which is a made-up idea and a slur. And I stood...
Yeah, just to point out, that's instead of transgender people, they say transgenderism to dismiss it as though it's some sort of...
Some ideology. Right, but it's not real, that it's just some kind of...
pathology, basically.
Right, exactly. They're trying to pathologize something. And I stood outside of a voting place with, listening to one of these far-right candidate representatives telling people that you needed to vote for her candidate because he was going to keep boys out of girls' bathrooms. Now, I can tell you that is not the issue in that local district. The issue was that they were worried that they weren't able to clean the schools. Principal was talking at a school board meeting about mice running over children's feet. They had no English language arts curriculum for the 2nd year in a row.
But Laura, were the mice transgender? That's the question.
That's the question. But that is your perfect example of a national level rhetoric being mapped onto a local election, which had nothing to do with the issues at hand, was merely being used as a kind of scare tactic.
Right. Well, that's Laura Pappano, and we're talking about her book, School Moms, Parent Activism, Partisan Politics, and the Battle for Public Education. And Laura is an award-winning journalist and author who's covered K-12 and higher education for over 30 years. Her works appeared in the New York Times, the Boston Globe, Slate, Washington Post, and other places like that. All right, Laura, I wanted to next, I could spend a lot of time on that. I have to move it along just so people can get a sense for what else is covered here. And the next part's just as interesting, really. It's about librarians. Let's talk about books. You say that battles over reading material have been fought down through the decades. This isn't necessarily a new thing, but we are seeing a big revival of book banning fervor. So it's sort of a pendulum, and we're swinging back onto the side of the pendulum that's about banning the books. And you introduced us to a Texas State Representative, Matt Krause, and he made this list of books that's now started spreading around the country. So talk about the book bans, where they're coming from, what Krause's role is.
Yeah, so he was running for office, and it turns out not effectively, and he's still running now, although he's moved down a bunch of rungs on when I think he's running for county commissioner in Tarrant County. But what he did is he issued this list of 850 books that he said were problematic. And he, in his power at that time as a state legislator, sent this kind of demand letter to all the school districts, having them kind of list if they obtained the book, how much they spent on it, where it was located. I mean, just exhaustive amounts of work that was incredibly frightening for all of the librarians receiving this. And what was interesting, though, is that he would never reveal how he came up with the list. And a lot of local media in Texas had a ball with this because, there was like a book of inventions. Some of the stuff was completely nonsensical. And yet there was on Twitter, Chris Tackett, who is a great person to follow on Twitter. He and his wife, Mindy, really keep track of like white Christian nationalism. And he posted a photo of a box of books being rolled out of the Granbury ISD library. And it just said on the outside of the carton, Krause's books. So it was
like someone just labeled it that way.
Just labeled it. I mean, it was this, you could not have scripted kind of a fear tactic more effective. And what did it do? It did get him a lot of attention. It also kind of spurred a similar thing happening all around the country where people started standing up at school board readings, reading portions of books aloud. And we all know there are, the nature of reading, and this is something I think we don't think enough about. Reading is often a very private act. There is a very big difference between reading something aloud in a public meeting, reading it privately to yourself, versus having it assigned in a class and discussing in a class. There's so many ways that we interact with books and reading, and we seem to have completely forgotten that. And that children learn a lot about themselves, about other people from reading. And there's this kind of, one librarian made the point.
That's why they're scared of it.
Well, there is one librarian said to me, she said, people think that if you read a book about the character doing something, that then kids will go do it. She said, that is not how books work.
No.
And so we have this
Teachers sometimes probably wish they did. Like, just read this book, problem solved.
Well, truly. And I think that we're having a really alarming misunderstanding. And I think it's probably because we don't read enough as a society, that we don't engage enough with books and ideas and thinking. So, it's created this grand book crazy attacks on, and I thought, when I was writing about it, and this is doing the writing 2 years ago, I thought it would kind of chill out, but it's done anything but. And I was on a panel in Tennessee with a librarian recently, and she was the librarian Lindsay Kimmery, who leads off one of the chapters. And at that time, she was testifying against a bill, I think it was House Bill 1944 in Tennessee, about holding librarians criminally liable for books, that someone deemed obscene. And, the bill did die. But she told me just a couple of weeks ago, she said, everyone has been so focused on the vouchers that there are these other attempts to reintroduce similar kinds of legislation. Mm-hmm. And so we are in a really tough way. The idea that we should legislate what librarians do is completely ridiculous. And I can give you one example. In Keller ISD, that was one of those school boards that was flipped. They decided that instead of having the librarians curate the books, that they would approve the purchase of every single book. So I was watching a 5.5-hour school board meeting at which a librarian stood up and made the point that this new curation process was lengthy, detailed, required the school board to approve everything. And she said, I cannot get books on camels or squirrels or football in a timely manner. She said, I cannot get the latest Diary of a Wimpy Kid. I cannot get the latest Guinness Book of World Records until it's approved by the school board. She goes, I have kids walking up to me asking, where are the new books?
Yeah, where's the new Dog Man?
She said, I don't tell them that it's political. And yet we have, we see this obfuscation that just absolutely is an affront to the professionalism of librarians and for their, for what we need our kids. We want our kids to read books, don't we?
2 points I wanted to ask you about here is you point out that a lot of these books that wind up on these lists pertain to race and pertain to LGBTQ characters. If there's even any mention or suggestion that a character might be LGBTQ, those books wind up on these lists. If there's books that address racism, those books wind up on these lists. And this is really a lot about erasing minority students and minority representations in public libraries. The problem there is a library needs to be representative of all the people that might go to that library. It should include things that everyone disagrees with. It also should include things that pertain to different age levels and different levels of maturity. So we shouldn't expect every book to be appropriate for a kindergartner that 6th graders, 7th, 8th, 9th, all the way up would read, right? So erasure of LGBTQ folks, and then expecting every book to be okay for everybody. So let's have that in mind as I ask you what recourse we have. How is this not bumping up against First Amendment issues about, can we rely on these laws getting struck down by the courts? Like, what's our recourse as we're facing these book bans?
Well, first of all, they do run into First Amendment issues. And that's been one of the arguments, in fact, in Escambia County in Florida. That is where we are right now. There's a lawsuit with PEN America and a group of local educators and parents, because that's one of the 2 counties in Florida that has had the most banned books. And it is an affront to First Amendment rights. But I think it also, we're also, you brought up the point about the age of children. Not every book is appropriate for every person at any age. And that's what librarians are experts at. They are experts. Mm-hmm. And they're the ones who kids walk up to, and the librarian knows their reading taste and can find a book that they would probably like. And that's mm-hmm. A powerful, powerful role. And I think there's a big difference between having books available in the library for whomever wants to check them out. And if you don't want your child to read certain books, then librarians are perfectly happy to accommodate you. We are not seeing genderqueer, in elementary school libraries. It simply isn't true. And yet, when I read genderqueer, I thought, I have not understood before now gender, fluidity
and you learned from it. Yeah.
I learned from it. I was like, you know what? And it's not a very sexy book, frankly. If everyone was really worried about that. And I think it's really important to understand what other people are going through, because everyone is not us. And that's what I think is the power of books. And I think that's why, as you say, I want to understand. The hate you give. I actually, I don't want to admit it now, but I did buy a whole classroom set for somebody in Texas.
Yeah.
But those are experiences that kids can relate to that another child may not relate to, but are powerful messages and reading and literature for people to understand. And so I think the idea that there's a certain kind of narrow, whitewashed, acceptable list of books is just an affront to an American, democracy, and it's an affront to parents too. We want our children to have different experiences and to be empathetic towards others.
And as you said, legal challenges can be successful here, but you also point out in your book that sometimes the chilling effect is really what matters the most. So a state that passes a law banning certain books, it becomes visible. Like kids who are LGBTQ might see certain books on those lists and already feel the ostracization. Or teachers might be wary about what kind of books they put in their classrooms because they just don't want the headaches and the controversies that come from being more representative in the books they provide. So I think sometimes it's already mission accomplished. Even when these bills aren't successful, the chilling effect is really just as effective.
And I've heard that from people within, I had a conversation with someone who's a Black man whose mom is a school teacher in Florida and was getting ready to retire and wanted to give away her collection, but was afraid to do it because giving away that collection of books, just that simple act, she worried would bring attention to herself. People stop themselves. They self-censor themselves. And they do it just because they are afraid of drawing attention to themselves, being in the middle of controversy, of getting targeted. And you know what? They're not wrong. I mean, there are people in the book who have lost, Matthew Hahn lost his job. And he's someone that I'm still in touch with and have conversations with. And it is heartbreaking. It is absolutely heartbreaking. I mean, there was a teacher in Georgia who was fired from her jobs along political lines after reading a book aloud to her 5th grade class that she had purchased at the school book fair. And we're in a very, very worrisome time when it comes to how we're treating professionals and books and our misunderstanding of what education is. I cited the statistic earlier about 90% of students in America attend public schools. Well, in 1986, 70% of them were white. In 2023, 46% were white. And by 2030, 43% will be white. The demographics are changing. And this is why I am baffled as to why inclusion is even a political issue. Because we need everyone to be included, to feel they belong, going back to social emotional learning. When you belong, you perform better. To feel that they belong and can become part of our multicultural fabric of our society. And it is just, it doesn't make sense.
Right. And I love that you include those studies that point out that not only do I think it's morally right to be inclusive and to think about diversity, but it's also just pragmatically right that kids do better statistically when they feel they belong, when they're not worried about bullying, when they're not feeling ostracized, and when they see themselves represented within the school, whether it be a pride flag or a Black Lives Matter sign or an American flag or books that have characters that look or sound or behave like them or books that have people who are way different from them. And so the educational outcomes are improved when diversity is encouraged within schools.
And there is legitimate, it's not just like we feel that, although everyone who's listening can probably feel that if they walk into a room and know that everybody loves them, they're going to do a better job at whatever task is in front of them than if they're walking into a situation where they feel that they're on guard and disrespected and viewed as suspicious. But, Jeffrey Cohen in Stanford, and he has a book that I think came out last year called Belonging, and I had interviewed him for a Boston Globe column probably almost 10 years ago now, where, talking about some of his research that connects actual grades and performance to that sense of feeling that you belong. And there's also research around low-income first-gen students that if you set them up when they get on campus to feel like, everybody, it's very common to do poorly in a class at the beginning because you're still trying to figure it out versus, oh my gosh, if I don't do well, I don't fit in here, I don't belong. And that goes back to what we're talking about, growth mindset. There are a lot of tools that American educational psychology has come up with since James Comer back in the 60s that are really helping schools and students perform better. And we should be paying attention to those, positive mindset, the idea that if you're not good at something right away doesn't mean it's over and you should throw up your hands and say, I can't do this. But rather go back at it.
Learning. Yeah,
exactly.
Sounds a lot like Marxism to me, Laura. I don't know.
Well, I don't know how they get there. I don't know how they get to Marxism from there. I think it's just picking scary words.
Yeah, exactly. It's a scary word thing. Let's pivot, speaking of which, to critical race theory. This is something they've made into a scary word. As COVID was happening, as these parental rights groups and Moms for Liberty were on the rise, it coincided with the killing of George Floyd. And America was kind of hitting a point of reckoning with racism on a national level as it tends to do. Every couple of years, things go back and forth. Then this critical race theory, CRT, became a focus for conservatives, which is especially strange because CRT is a pretty arcane theory, a legal theory and way of sort of philosophically analyzing history and social systems, not being taught in elementary schools. But all of a sudden, all of these critics started thinking that it was, and then it became a flashpoint. This is also symptomatic, I think, of the approach of a group like Moms for Liberty, that they can take something like critical race theory, turn it into a boogeyman, and then use it for political leverage. So I'm interested in your thoughts about how CRT has been used that way.
Well, actually, it's Chris Rufo, if we're going to be specific. So Chris Rufo was the one who, he said it right on Twitter, on his feed, that, I'm going to take this and we're going to change the meaning of this brand.
Yeah,
and he called it a brand. And we are going to make it so that when somebody sees this word, this CRT phrase, that they will just think everything bad and crazy. So he took something with the only thing that it has to do with actual what critical race theory is. And, the bottom line is that nobody really even knows what the modern iteration that we're talking about here is of CRT. What is CRT? Nobody knows. You ask people.
Right. The people who are afraid of it don't know,
and they're just like, it's just bad. We just know that it's bad. And in the Idaho
race. It's racist against white people is what they would say.
Exactly.
And you'd say, how so? I don't know.
No, and there's no depth to it. It's just become this kind of, abbreviated handle. And you now are seeing DEI being the new CRT.
That's
and again,
the new thing.
Chris Rufo laid it out, and he said, we're going to do for DEI what we did basically for CRT. He made it clear in one of his year-end newsletters. So this is one of these things where it's just, we can look at this at every single level. The vagueness of language and meaning allows people to attach a lot of unclear, fearful ideas to something that nobody can really define. So as a result, you have legislatures kind of with anti-CRT laws that are so vague
and
that teachers don't even know what they can. And now and I actually just finished reporting a story on anti-DEI laws in higher education. Spent a lot of time in Florida.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And Utah just passed a bill and the governor signed it.
And Utah, there are 12 or 13 states that have passed these laws. And what do they really mean? How do you actually enforce them? All you do is you see, offices being shut down. You see people afraid to say certain words. You see people changing the names of classes, taking certain books off lists. What you have is just people, again, going back to your earlier point about the kind of self-censorship. This is what we see. And, there have been teachers who are like, I'm afraid I'm going to lose my job, so I'm just going to, I'm just not going to discuss this. Well, that's a real harm to a lot of, if we look at the demographics of students in America, they need to know that their history exists and matters. And they need to understand the truth of that history and not just some kind of made-up brief version of it. So I think it's an incredibly, the CRT thing, and I've heard people argue, and this was during my reporting in Idaho, that SEL is a Trojan horse for getting to CRT. And when you hear that exact phrase over and over again, it's like, what the heck does that mean? Because I have
All I
no
know is
idea.
Trojan horses are bad, and I don't like them.
They're bad, they're tricky. And there's someone, I was interviewing a campaign manager for one of the far-right candidates in Idaho, and I kept asking, I said, well, what is SEL? What are these things? Yeah. And he finally said, he goes, I don't know, but we don't like them. Yeah. And that's where we are. So the bigger issue is that we're talking about teams. We're talking about some people who want to have a certain very narrow vision of who counts and who matters in America and who doesn't. And I am puzzled. I understand why certain people want that power, but I don't understand what the end game is for that, because we need everybody. We need everyone's intelligence. We need everyone's contributions. We cannot decide that certain people don't count.
Right. Well, I would suggest your own research gives you clues to answer your question there, which is follow the money. A lot of these groups are connected with charter school and voucher programs, and to the extent that they can discredit the public school system, they can help redirect public school money to private interests, private schools, and there's money to be made here, frankly. And I'm not saying that all charter schools are bad or that private schools themselves are necessarily bad, but there's a lot less regulation there. There are problems that need to be reckoned with. And I think a lot of these groups, a lot of the panic over CRT, over racism, over LGBTQ folks is really about sort of trying to dismantle public ed in general and trying to privatize public ed. That's my kind of working theory.
So when I was working at doing the research, I was like, that's what I'm seeing happen. This looks pretty clear to me. And now 2 years later, it is abundantly clear and everybody's saying it out loud. Even they're saying it out loud. Even the far right saying it out loud. I mean, it is very, very much an effort to dismantle public education, to have people feel like, what's the point? Let's just all go our own way. And, what we're seeing with vouchers is exactly that. I was covering education in Massachusetts when the very first charter schools were starting. And there were a lot of rules and regulations around the charter schools. They were supposed to be laboratories of innovation. I used to cover a lot of charter schools in my column, and there were some fabulous, fabulous charter schools. But here's what I think is flipped. The difference is that back then, people who were starting charter schools were thinking, you know what? I think I've got an idea for doing it better. I think we can reach this group of kids, in Mission Hill and Roxbury. That was the birth of Roxbury Prep. We can follow them and teach them and coach them into college and through college. Or, there was this kind of purposeful effort to improve the opportunities for different groups of children. What we see now, when we say charter school now, we're talking about something very, very different. If we look at charter schools in Florida, many of them don't last but a few years. When I was looking at the voucher schools, when Florida just expanded their vouchers last year, I did a story for Hechinger Report and USA Today, and I was looking at the data. In Florida at that time, even before this most recent expansion, only 4% of voucher schools were accredited, non-religious, and nonprofit. So there is a lot of money to be made with this operation. We spend a lot of money on public education. One of my concerns is that as we've seen this voucher legislation, and it's also sometimes called education savings accounts, ESAs, they've lifted the kind of ceiling. So that used to be that this money was, you had to have a particular income to qualify. Now they're lifting that. So anybody, in some states, we're working towards a situation where anybody can get a voucher for $8,000 or $7,000, depending, per pupil. And they can, not only that, spend it on anything they want.
Yeah.
They just, in some states, they're just literally given a debit card. And this is where you've also seen the rise of, homeschoolers. And, homeschooling can be effective and useful and good. I would never deign to homeschool my children, but certain people have, and it's been effective. But we also have the situation where I'm not sure that anyone's watching to make sure that these kids are all okay. If you look at, there are a number of states with very little oversight, and that is deeply, deeply concerning to me for the welfare of the children, not only educational welfare, but their physical welfare.
Man, it really is through the looking glass on this, because it's like they're saying, think of the children, and I'm saying, think of the children. we're both saying, think of the children, right? There's a definite upside down world happening in all of these debates, and there's so much more we could talk about. But for people that are listening to the episode that might check out the book, what are a few takeaways, some suggestions you have for people about what they could do if they're concerned about anti-LGBTQ stuff in schools, if they're concerned about racism in schools and anti-DEI and CRT panic and all this? What are some practical things that people can do to help bring the conversation back to sanity?
Well, I think, we've spent a lot of time here talking about Moms for Liberty, but the counter to that is that there are a lot of mom groups, parent groups on the ground who are organizing to protect public schools in local districts. Being involved with those groups to make sure that you're electing people to your school board who are not going to then decide that they're in charge of choosing all the library books or the curriculum. I mean, and it's getting out and vote. This year is so consequential. 2024 is not just about, what's happening, in the presidential race. It's about what's happening all up and down and on the ground, particularly in your local communities. It's school boards, it's city councils, all the stuff that we think we didn't have to pay attention to. We need to pay attention to. We can't leave it up to somebody else, because if we leave it up to somebody else, it can become very, very problematic. There are so many examples of people leaving it up to someone else and then just being horrified at what that result has been. So this is why, if you want something to do, get involved, pay attention. It matters. It actually matters.
Write a note to a librarian that tells them you care about them.
And that too.
I agree. Getting involved with local groups. Organization is what matters. This is why Moms for Liberty and other groups have been successful, because they are organizing. So looking for ways to organize really matters. That's Laura Pappano. We're talking about her book, School Moms, Parent Activism, Partisan Politics, and the Battle for Public Education. All right, Laura, every episode ends with a segment called Regrets, Challenges, and Surprises. And this is a moment where you can speak to any of these things or all of them. Is there anything you regret about the book now that it's out, something you would change about it? Or what was most challenging in this particular book? And then was there anything that was surprising, any new revelations for yourself as you did the research?
Well, what I'd say is the hard thing is that I did the book early, right? So I did a lot of the reporting in early 2022, and I went to the hot spots. I went to Texas, I went to Tennessee, I went to Florida, I went to Eastern Pennsylvania, I went to New Hampshire. By definition, those hot spots were very white suburbs, not all, but predominantly. And so the people captured, not all of them, of course, because, the book has a variety of people in it, but it is a very white group. What I would say is that what we've seen since I turned in the manuscript is that we're seeing that this issue has spread to all different communities, and that parents in many, many different places are organizing around very similar issues. So, that's one of the things that if I had been able to report for longer and the publishing process were quicker, I would have tried to capture some of that, because certainly my reporting throughout my career has really tried to capture a span of people and experiences. And I guess the other revelation to me was, part of me was like, oh my gosh, I'm going to these places, I'm reporting this, it's all going to be over by the time the book gets out. And
I wish.
No, and I was kind of like, I just want to connect the dots, and, maybe, it'll all be over, but that's okay, because, that's it. But it's been anything but that. I can tell you that on a regular basis, I get emails from people, can you come here? Can you, I'm going outside of Baltimore next Friday. I'm going to Detroit. I'm going to a suburb of Detroit. It is one of these things where, people are down in, Virginia. Can you do a Zoom with us? All kinds of communities are experiencing this kind of challenge. No place seems to be safe from it. And it's not that that there's turmoil everywhere. I certainly don't want to kind of suggest that. But what I do suggest is that this is a moment where we all have to pay attention. And I know that there's some people who feel like, well, let's just get back to, regular old education reporting. And my sense is that we can't do this reporting as long as this stuff keeps getting in the way. So it's important for us to pay attention and hopefully get to the other side of this, and let's build community. One of the positive things that I've seen come out of my reporting and conversations is that I've asked people in different places, I've said, I know you're exhausted. I keep hearing how exhausted they are, moms are and parents are, but do you feel a sense of purpose and connection with people around you? And they said, absolutely. So I think that's been a really positive outcome.
Oh, that's terrific. I hope people can kind of take a page from the school moms in terms of getting organized, being energized, letting their passion help them get involved, help parents get involved. And we need more than parents. We need everybody in communities to think about schools and to vote and to help push back against the extremism that's overtaking local schools. And your book is a great way to learn about what those tactics are, what the reasons behind them are, what the beliefs are that we need to be familiar with, so that when we meet in the political arena, we're prepared. We're prepared with answers. We're prepared to represent our values and our desires.
And I think, Blair, one of the important things to remember is the problem that we have is with extremism. And that's what's hurting our institutions and our democracy.
Yeah, it speaks again to what you say in the beginning of your book, which is a school is supposed to be a place where everybody in the community can go. And there is a certain kind of extremism that would say, actually, no, everyone does need to be this thing. And that's the idea that you really want to push against, is the school does need to embrace everyone.
Absolutely. We need them. We need everybody.
We do. Well, thank you. Thank you, Laura. Thanks for
you.
taking the time to talk about this work with us, and keep doing the good work that you're doing.
You too. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Relationscapes, the podcast where we're mapping the stories and ideas that shape who we are and connect us with each other while angry conservative school moms are trying to destroy the world. So if you're joining us for the first time, welcome. I hope you'll check out some other episodes. There are a lot to choose from. I would also appreciate it if you took a moment to rate and review the show in Apple Podcasts or rate the show on Spotify. And recommending the show to friends is also, it's a really great way to grow the audience. So recommend it to a friend, or, you could recommend it to a frenemy. Exact your subtle revenge. Tell them to listen to this one if they don't think they'd like it. Okay. Mates of State, as always, provides our theme song. Relationscapes is part of the Dialogue Podcast Network. I'm journalist Blair Hodges in Salt Lake City, signing off until we meet again.